Welcome everyone from Westside, anyone else joining us. We had finished our study of church history in the first 4 centuries. I had an extra time, and so I went back and grabbed lessons I did in 2011 on the history of the Bible being translated out of Hebrew and English, the Old and New Testaments, into our English language. So a fascinating study. And last week we looked at the great price that was paid. We can't imagine that there were people that actually resisted translating the Bible into the language of the common people. And whether it be German in the mainland or French or all the other languages that are spoken there, and then English, of course, as we're concerned with England and coming then to America and our language predominantly being English. And so we can't imagine a people not being allowed to read the Bible in your own tongue. And that just seems to be the most basic of human rights. And yet you see the oppression that Satan is able to carry out through different men, through the auspices of the official church, the Roman at that time, the Roman Catholic Church, and then the Church of England, which was not very different in its hierarchy from the way it had been under Roman Catholicism. So we want to look at today then two lessons. I'm going to do this in two parts because the King James Version is just a lot of material. All right, there are two Bibles that finally come down toward the New King, the New King James. The Old King James will be 1611, but it'll take from 1604 to 1611. So before that, you have two Bibles, the Geneva Bible, and that's a result of, remember, Mary, Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, who was a Roman Catholic, staunch Roman Catholic, persecuted the Protestants mercilessly. She slaughtered, I think, 450 Protestants during her reign. And she so turned the English people against Roman Catholicism that it forever became a Protestant nation after that. G.K. Chesterton had said of her, Queen Mary was a bad queen, bad for lots of reasons, but bad most of all because she tried to burn out no popery and managed to burn it in, meaning she tried to stamp out anyone saying no pope and managed to burn it in by her just obstinate murdering of so many people. It just turned everyone against her. So the Geneva Bible was a result of then all those Protestants fleeing to the continent and translating a version in 1560 that became very popular with the people. In fact, King James I, who the Old King James will take its name after, actually read the Geneva Bible. That was the Bible that he used. And as you see here, it had theological notes from Protestant scholars, John Calvin, Beza, Knox, Whittingham. It is the Bible of Shakespeare and the one carried by the Pilgrims to America in AD 1620. All right, to answer that then, under Queen Elizabeth, it became known as the Bishop's Bible. So they did not like all those Protestant comments. You still have a very Roman type hierarchy. And some of the comments that are made about the Pope and all kinds of other things were written in the margins of the Geneva Bible. So they were ordered to translate and not have that and in the margins. And Queen Elizabeth, that succeeded in 1568. Every one of the translators, they were not all bishops at the time the Bishop's Bible came into being, but they all would become bishops, so it became known as that. So it was to be the answer, the official Bible that the Church of England used and demanded that everybody read, and they tried to stamp out all the other versions. But it just never was as good a translation as the Geneva Bible, and neither one of them would be as good a translation as the Old King James. All right, so we come to Queen Elizabeth dying in March 24 of 1603, and she had to choose a successor. You remember she was a virgin queen and never married, so she was telling her courtiers on her deathbed when they questioned her regarding succession, she answered, "Who but our cousin in Scotland?" So she reached out to King James VI of Scotland, and he became then the next in line to become the King of England on May the 7th. He arrived in London that had a population of 140,000 people at that time, with an extra 40,000 that had shown up to see the new king. He was crowned on the 25th of July, 1603, and 100,000 visitors had swelled the population. So shortly after his coronation, plague broke out. Again, think about what's happening right now. There have been many times this happened in history. Sometimes we just, side note here about COVID, we think it's so awful, and it is. I'm not trying to make light of it, but 30,000 people would die out of that 100 added to the 140. So do the math there. 30 out of 240,000 people would die of plague. And it was a very common thing with so many people massed together in that time. So as a result of that, King James I moved to Hampton Court. It was a brick palace of 1,000 rooms. It was 12 miles up the Thames, the River Thames, to escape the plague-ridden city. And on his way down to England, and it was a long procession, and people were all along the way to see the new King of England that was coming from Scotland to London. He received from the Puritans, okay, and we'll talk about some of these guys later, but they delivered what is called the Millenary Petition. It was signed by 1,000 Puritan ministers to hear their grievances against the official Church of England, okay? And we'll talk about some of their beliefs at the end. So King James I agreed to hear. I mean, he's a new king. He sees that he better politically do this, even though he was very much opposed to it, and the hierarchy of the church was very opposed to it. And because of the plague and other things, the conference would not begin until January the 14th of 1604. And here's a picture of the gate that leads into that obviously very large palace with 1,000 rooms. In fact, it would be the residence of the royal family until well into the 1700s, when it would finally be not used as the official residence. So this is the Great Hall of Hampton Court, and this is where King James received the petition of the Puritans in 1604. This is a picture that was drawn. It is entitled "The Translators Presenting the Bible to James I." Shows quite a few guys out there, probably not accurate. There probably were only about 4 Puritans, and they were dressed very plainly. You can kind of see that in their dress compared to all the guys standing around the king. All their finery, all the latest fashion, which seems really weird to us. They look like they're wearing short mini skirts, but anyway, the fashion of the time, and they are all the powerful men, okay? Not only at the court of King James, you can see how royally he's decked out, and also the official arm of the church, and so the Church of England. And so all the bishops, deans of the colleges, the hierarchy, the Archbishop of Canterbury, all are there. The Puritans are in their plain clothes, and there were only 4 of them, okay? So the painting is not accurate from that standpoint. And John Reynolds, you will see sometimes his name spelled Reynolds, but obviously it came down to us in our day as being Reynolds. And he was a Puritan. He would become one of the translators on the King James group of men that translated it. But he was president of Corpus Christi College of Oxford. Okay, you had 3 major places where the King James translators would be, but 2 of them are the university complexes of Cambridge and Oxford that still exist today and are in the top 5 colleges in the universities in the world, not just the United Kingdom in Great Britain, but in the world. And you've had famous men in our time. Bill Clinton is one who attended Oxford, I believe it was. So there have been many others. But anyway, a lot of colleges that were independent. They ran their own sort of thing within the university complex. So you'll see Christ College, you'll see Corpus Christi College, meaning the body of Christ. And this particular guy, John Reynolds, is the dean of Corpus Christi College at Oxford. And so these are his words. He said, because those that were allowed, he said, the versions before in the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI were corrupt and not answerable to the truth of the original. And what he means by that is that they had been translated from the Latin, the Vulgate, all right? They didn't go back to the original Greek and Hebrew and do a good job of translating it directly into English from the original language it was written in, but they went through a version, through Latin, and then to the original, to English. And so it was not looked at as being this is a big step. This is a step that they've not taken with that kind of ferocity that they will with the King James, and that is that they go back to the original languages and only back to the original languages, not meaning they don't look at cognate words and other things that are in other languages. Well, immediately, Richard Bancroft, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, so remember, he now is sort of the Church of England. He becomes the head of the Church of England, not the Pope. All right, this is the split that happened when King Henry VIII wasn't going to be granted his divorce. Remember, and he split and had Parliament make him the head of the Church of England, which the monarch of England is to this day. But Richard Bancroft, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is the ecclesiastical side, all right, the guy that's in the church side of things. And don't remember, I'm not using church the way the Bible does, okay? I think you know that. So he jumps up immediately and says, if every man's humor was followed, there'd be no end of translating. And of course, that had been the case before, and it's not going to end. I mean, you know how many versions have come along, even like right now. I use the English Standard Version. It's a very new version, a good version, but a very new version, a translation. So they were very much opposed to it. But what Bancroft didn't count on is that the King James he was a scholar type king, and so he also knew languages and different things. And I think that he realized England was coming into its own, and the English language was going to be a very powerful tool, and it was becoming a very powerful country. And so he looked at this as a time to do something officially, that it would be good for his reign coming in, particularly him being Scots and coming down to England. And so Bancroft even pled, falling on his knees, that the king wouldn't go for this, but the king made it point that he wanted a new official version. And so Bancroft was enough of a politician, which all those guys were, and a monarchist, to see that James was thick on the idea, and therefore the church itself should take the initiative. So the time was right. There had been 40 years. A lot of progress had been made in the Greek and Hebrew studies at Oxford and Cambridge. There were endowed chairs in both language. Remember that for more than for 1,000 years, as I said, the Latin Vulgate had held sway over the Roman Catholic Church and over the English Church. And nothing of note had been done since 1568 of the Bishop's Bible and the Geneva Bible before it. And even though it was the last authorized Bible, everybody was using the Geneva Bible, including King James himself. But again, he saw this as a great opportunity. Bobrick says in his Wide as the Waters Be, the History of the English Bible, he said he had never yet seen a Bible well translated into English, including by inference the bishops, and yearned for one uniform translation. This is King James, the monarch, which all denominations could accept. Thought this could best be done by outstanding scholars in both the universities, Oxford, Cambridge, after them to be reviewed by the bishops and the chief learned of the church. The new translation would then be presented to the Privy Council, those that were we would say the cabinet of the president, and lastly ratified by the royal authority. And so the whole idea of the church became bound up in this, and Bancroft was enough of a politician to see that. And so he commissions 54 scholars. This is the first time that anything like this has ever happened. We can't imagine a time. Now there may be over 100 scholars that are involved in the translation of, like, the New King James and the English Standard Versions, for instance. But this was a brand new thing to think about. Remember, before we were seeing only one guy was translating, like Tyndale's Bible and Miles Coverdale and some of those that we had seen before. And so for 6 years, the 6 teams of scholars used the Textus Receptus. Remember that Erasmus had made all of those different manuscripts, had brought them together into a Greek Bible, basically, and is called the received text, all right, the Latin Textus Receptus. The Bishop's Bible, Tyndale's, Coverdale's, Matthew's, the Genevan, they were all to be compared. They were all to be looked at, but especially, as we'll find out, the Bishop's Bible, because, again, the church is going to take hold of this. So the men were divided into 6 companies, and Westminster is Westminster Abbey, which if you've been to London, you know it's right there. It was a seat of power at that time, connected to what is Parliament, Big Ben, all of that. If you've been there, you've seen it. And Cambridge and Oxford, of course, were about 50 miles away in different directions, a little over 50 miles away in different directions, and they were great university communities and had been in existence, one of them since 1000 AD and the other since 1200 AD. And different colleges had been added and funded as they are always by men and women that are interested in them. So 6 companies: the first Westminster, second, first Cambridge, second, and first Oxford, and second Oxford. And then here you can see on the right all the different parts of the Bible that they were assigned. And we'll see how all of this would come about. Notice the Apocrypha, the second Westminster there, number 4. The Apocrypha are the writings, remember I told you, that found their way into the Roman Catholics' Bible. Even to this day, they use them. But remember, the Jews have never. Of course, they're the ones. Their people authored the Apocrypha, and it was written during the intertestament period between the Old Testament and the New Testament times. And even the Jews do not consider the Apocrypha inspired books. But along come a bunch of Gentiles, and they decide that they are, equal to the words of God. And yet, that never held sway with the Protestants. Eventually, they just you rarely find a Bible that has the Apocrypha in it if it has a Protestant background. But the Catholics, of course, still do. The Jews do not, as I said to you. All right, so I just thought I'd show you the 3 places as they exist today. Here's modern Westminster Abbey, but a lot of it ancient. If you've ever visited there, interesting place. Lots of famous people buried there. The throne that since 1066, just a plain wooden looking chair to us, is where the kings or queens of England are coronated. And it's all done at Westminster Abbey. There's a famous bust of George Washington in the basement of this building, if you can imagine that. Lots of people buried there. But anyway, this is where the Westminster group translated in the Jerusalem chamber. And there's a picture of the great room that still exists today. It's used by the dean of that particular function of that place. And then if you move due north 55 miles, you come to Cambridge. All right, there's a Cambridge, Massachusetts. You remember that many names of English origin would find their way to America as well. So don't mistake the two, because you have a famous college in Cambridge, Massachusetts as well. But this is Cambridge, England. Okay, so King's College is probably one of the most famous that are there. And again, it's a complex of many colleges that exist inside the basic university that we would call the University of Cambridge. And you see how ancient the buildings are, but notice how designs differ, and because it spans over centuries of time, as I was saying to you. And then the final group is again of just about the same number of miles, but a little more to the west and north. And of course, this is Oxford, and this is a famous Tom Quad. It's the largest quad, because a lot of times they would build that inner court. You might remember the movie Chariots of Fire, where the guys ran, remember, around the courtyard to see who could, and that was always a common thing. And I can't remember if it was at Oxford or Cambridge that they did that, but this kind of quad thing was in that picture. And the Tom Tower, that it's called. There's a aerial panorama of the university. You can see how big it is, how beautiful all those areas are. Lots and lots of people go every year to see Oxford. All right, so these are the 3 places, okay, that the King James will be translated over those several years. So Bancroft, remember, is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he takes full control of this. And I've left the original. I didn't misspell these words. That's how they were spelled at the time. So you can imagine us trying to go back and converse with these people. It looks like the word absurd, but it's observed. The rules to be observed, so the U becomes a V to us in translation. So I've left the original, and you can make it out, and I'll help with anything that may be a little difficult. Rule number 1, the ordinary Bible read in church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, is to be followed and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. So you can see how they were spelling some words, and we've dropped extra T's and L's as time has gone on, and P's as well in the word bishops there. But they wanted to again, that official they wanted, and it's been estimated that only 8% of the Bishop's Bible's language made it into the Old King James. It's just not a very good version. And that became very, very evident to these men who were very, very tied into knowing how to translate. I mean, the King James language is just in everybody's mind. Even as day, you can say certain things and people will know. Now it's becoming less and less common because we're less and less a Bible-oriented people. They consulted Tyndale's and Matthew's and Coverdale's in the Great Bible, and those are some of the ones that we looked at last week. I'm not going to show you all the rules, but I just thought some of these were interesting. Rule number 3, the old, okay, we dropped the U out of old. The old ecclesiastical words to be kept vis-a-vis as the word church, not to be translated congregation. Now, why do they do that? It's because the Presbyterians at that time denied any scriptural authority to the bishops, and they were separatists. They believed the bishops were wholly wrong. This idea was that you were to have elders, all right, presbyters. Remember, we studied all of that? That's exactly where we get the word elder. And so those of us that understand in churches of Christ that we have a group of men, 2 or more. It always has to be a plurality. And the word presbyter, again, the Presbyterian Church would take its name from that, but they initially were separatists, to separate from the Church of England and its hierarchy of these bishops that controlled dioceses. And they were called Congregationalists. So not a bad word. Church and congregation both are translating the word assembly, basically. It is the word ecclesia, from which we even get the word ecclesiastical, but it means an assembly of people that belong to God, whether we looked at it universal or in a local sense. All right, so in 1526, Tyndale had translated the Greek word ecclesia not as church, but as congregation. And again, because the word church had taken on that official, hierarchy of Rome and again of the Church of England. So he translated presbyteros not as priest. Can you imagine? But they were. There's a different word, hierus, I believe it is, that translates the word priest in Greek. It's not priest. It is senior or elder, and that's how Tyndale translated it. So they were on to the truth. They were on to what you and I hold to as we think about what the Bible says about that. And of course, that was a huge affront to the bishops and the archbishops and all of that. And they didn't want to have any of that in the Bible that was going to be translated by the King James translators. Right, rule number 6, no marginal notes at all to be affixed, but only for ye as thee. Okay, just remember that. The explanation of the Hebrew or Greek words. Okay, so they didn't want any of that Geneva business. And that was good, to have a clean version, and that would hold sway. There never would. I mean, there are Bibles still that when the edition comes out has footnotes and has all kinds of writings, and we always are telling people, be careful of that. Be careful. These are men who are putting what they think down in the margins. Just get a good Bible. All right, get a good Bible that translates the Greek into the English, translate the Hebrew into English, and having as clean a Bible as possible. Nicholson would say the text, as all good Protestants might require, was to be presented clean and sufficient of itself. And again, that would hold sway the rest of the ages of translation. Rule number 8, every particular man of each company, remember those 6 companies, to take the same chapter and having translated them by himself where he thinks good, all to meet together, confer, and agree for their parts what shall stand. So each man had a section of that, whatever they were assigned, that part of the, from Genesis to whatever. And then they would translate, then they'd bring it to the group of men that were their company. And again, if you had 6 companies, roughly 8 guys to each company, but there were more and less depending on, not usually less by much. And they would take it to all when they had questions, and then they would tweak it, and then they would send their final product to the other groups who would also do the same with them, and everybody would work on it again. So you can imagine why this takes from 1604 to 1611, 7 years for it, or 6 and 7 years for it to come to pass. Bobbert goes on to say, every scholar went over some portion of this text, amending it verse by verse as he saw fit. Then he compared his work with that of his colleagues, who after conferred together as to what should or should not stand. And once a book of the Bible was completed in this way, it was sent to all the other groups for suggestion and review, and eventually every word passed through the hands of the whole body of revisers. There was a guy named Richard Kilby that we're going to see later as one of the translators, overheard a young parson suggest that a certain passage be reworded. And he told the young man that, quote, not only had his panel discussed at length the proposed reading that this preacher, that I'm using Bob Brooks' word, parson, that this preacher had thought it ought to be translated. He said, not only had we discussed at length that reading, we discussed 13 other possible readings. And only then did we decide on the phrasing that was in the King James Version. All right, rule number 9 is one company hath dispatched any one book in this matter, they shall send to the rest, be considered seriously and judicially, for his majesty is very careful on this point. So for the first time, you have guys checking other guys. That's not happened before. Tyndall translated his, covered all those guys by themselves. But this will, it just seems common sense to us in our day that this is the first time that this is happening. And so the majesty, that is King James, the first, was very careful on this point. He wanted to make sure that everybody looked at it and that they came to a consensus. So by the end of 1608, the 6 companies are done with the translating, and then there's a committee of review that meets for 9 months beginning in January of 1609 to examine their colleagues' work. So now it goes through a whole nother process. There are only 3 names of the committee members, the 6 that we know: John Boyce, Andrew Downes, and John Harmer. There were at least 3, but we don't know the rest. The committee's work on Romans to Revelation was lost to history for 350 years until it was discovered by accident in the Bodleian, if I'm pronouncing that right, Bodleian Library in 1958. There was a scholar there that just happened to find it. And you imagine all these ancient libraries that are in all these universities. And it had the margins and the notes of one of the translators of the King James. And so you got to see the process, the thinking process, and they had kept it. For instance, 1 Corinthians 15:33, evil companionship corrupts what? Good morals or manners, we say. The old King James took up the word good manners, and it prevailed over good natures or good dispositions. Now, it wouldn't have been too bad of words, but that cadence. Evil communication corrupts good manners, or as we say, evil companionship corrupts good morals in the New King James Version. The Galatians chapter 3:28, the law was our schoolmaster, is how it comes down to us in the old King James. Prevailed over leader or petty master. Can you imagine petty master coming down to us? And we're going to look at some others later. Right now, I want to turn and just let you know some things about some of the translators. These men are amazing. Lancelot Andrewes was the dean at Westminster. He was a remarkable linguist. He mastered 15 different languages, including Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Syriac, and even Chaldee. He began studying Greek when he was 6 years old. I'm going to tell you, we live in a time that has far more knowledge, but as one guy said, doesn't mean we have knowledge. Doesn't mean we know anything. These guys were amazing. You imagine studying Greek at 6 years old and mastering it. Eventually, the quote there by Bruce Metzger, he became acquainted with so many languages that so it was said, had he been present at the Tower of Babel, he could have served as interpreter general. Lawrence Chatterton, who happened to be a Puritan. Notice his very simple dress. They went away from all that gaudy stuff that the bishops and all that wore. He was Dean of Christ College at the University of Oxford. He was an outstanding linguist, proficient in Hebrew, Latin, Greek, Spanish, and French. He was one of the great preachers of his day. He had a very clear and pleasant voice. To pick up the quote by Bobrick, on one occasion, having preached for 2 hours straight, he broke off so as not to try their patience. But the entire congregation cried out, "For God's sake, go on, go on." And so for another hour he did. I just thought I'd share that with you. If you ever think a preacher's long-winded in our day, particularly me, just remember that this congregation shouted out for him to go further. Of course, you could probably say, yeah, but he was a better preacher than you are. And I know where y'all live. All right, so he became the longest lived of the translators. He would die at the age of 105. He would survive the reign of 4 Tudors, 2 Stuarts, and into the English Civil War. He would actually see Charles I, the son of King James I, be beheaded in the time of Cromwell. All right, John Reynolds, remember we mentioned him. He's the one that brings the millenary petition of the Puritans. Again, he's also a significant man, president of the Corpus Christi College at Oxford, foremost Greek scholar of the time, and he was an eloquent spokesman of the Puritans. The man whose idea it had been, Benson Project says, the translation project had been. His colleague described him as a living library, as a third university, or as a university unto himself. His knowledge was so great. The Oxford Company met once a week in his lodgings, where he was often laid up in these years with gout and consumption. And consumption, remember, was the term that they gave to things like tuberculosis, cancer, as the body just wasted away. So for 2.5 years, they toiled on the Old Testament text. Isaiah to Malachi was their assignment. His wasting away was accelerated by the hard translation work. He died, quote, looking very like a skeleton on the 21st of May, 1607. We don't have any pictures of Richard Kilby, and I searched in vain to try to find anything. But he was rector of Lincoln College at Oxford. He is buried in the Tower of Lincoln, that great tower in the back there, and a lot of these different buildings were added. He preached like, quote, a brand plucked from the burning in a lot of sermons. One sermon, The Burden of the Laden Conscience. He lamented his own sinful ways when he was a young man. Young and old, he said, take heed by me, he warned, have no more gods but one. He died in 1620, leaving his entire estate to his flock. A plaque over his tomb there at that tower reads, Lo, Richard Kilby lieth here, which lately was our minister. To the poor he ever was a friend, and gave them all he had in the end. And in that day, those that were high up in ecclesiastical positions were paid very handsomely. They were alongside the guys that were at court, and so they were rich, rich men many times, as we've seen all the way back to the time of Constantine. And he gave it all to the poor. Final man that we'll look at, there were, remember, 54 of these guys, was a man by the name of John Boyce. He was a second Cambridge Company Dean of Canterbury, St. John's College. And this is one of it. Now, just thought you need to know about this guy. By age 6, he could read the entire Old Testament in Hebrew. Now imagine that with any 6-year-old today. By age 13, he knew New Testament and classical Greek well enough to be very proficient in them. Here was his habit. He rose at 4 a.m. and studied until 8 p.m. To the end of his life, his eyes were clear, his hearing sharp, and he had almost a Hebrew alphabet of teeth when he died. I thought that was a great quote. Hebrew alphabet has, I think, 22 letters, and so he had almost a full set of teeth. He was he ate lightly, he fasted often, he seldom drank, and after each meal he was very careful, almost, quote, to a curiosity, in picking and rubbing his teeth, as we would say, to brush them. And that's how he kept them all, obviously, because we know he believed it was a special preservative to the end of life. All right, our last quote, and then we'll do a separate and last video, and we'll put this one out and then tell you when the other's coming. It would be difficult now to bring together a group of more than 50 scholars with the range of languages and knowledge of other disciplines that characterize the King James translators. We may live in a world with more knowledge, but it's populated by people with less knowledge. And I thought that was a powerful quote by Gordon Campbell. These men were extraordinary, and they brought past a Bible that would hold sway for the next 400 years, basically. I mean, obviously, versions began to take its sway back, 300 years after it came into existence, or maybe 350, and then you start seeing proliferation of the American Standard, the New American Standard, and so forth, the Revised Standard, New King James, and down to the English Standard today, and others, the NIV. And obviously lots of people use those today, but for 3 centuries, the English-speaking world knew only this Bible, and that's why the phraseology influenced our language so greatly. These men had a powerful impact, not only on English, but obviously they made such a translation that held sway. All right, thank you very much for paying attention, and I'll let you know when we will conclude with the last study of the King James.